Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 1 of Intercultural Conversations. And not that there are too many people listening, but it's so nice for me to hear from the people who do listen about when the next episodes are going to be and when and who is going to be the next guest. I think it just gives me a reassurance that I'm not doing all this in a void and that it has some effect, or at least is compelling people to think, if nothing else. So I'm so happy that I get to do this and I get to meet amazing people and I get to invite amazing people on this show. And I'm extremely excited about our guest as well for today. But before I introduce her, I just wanted to kind of introduce the subject to you of what we're going to speak about today. Today we're talking about biases, and I think everybody looks at the world with a lens of bias, and that bias can be learned. That bias can be through lived experiences as well. So the moment you meet a new group of people, and sometimes when you make a judgment about those group of people or the person, it comes through a space of biasness. And in an age where we have accessibility to so much information that is subjected to algorithms, we are also constantly exposed to the similar kind of information as well, which kind of changes the way we think and changes the way we see the world too, that we often fail to see that there are multiple perspectives to any situation. And I think that was also my motivation to start Intercultural Conversations, so that number one, of course, we get multiple perspectives, but also that we recognize certain kind of biasness in us and hopefully approach people with much more empathy. So today, to talk about this subject, because I'm not an expert on this for sure, I've invited Jill Sheldekar. Jill is a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, and she actually also conducts workshops about biases, and she is the Director of Ethnosynth Consultancy, which is a leadership and intercultural training organization as well, which I'm also associated with. And she has also been the former president of an organization called GLOW. GLOW is an organization, or used to be an organization, that brought women in leadership positions or women who are starting off together as a platform, as an opportunity to interact with each other. And today, hopefully, we are able to, through this conversation, firstly give some insight and also some takeaways, for the lack of a better word, of how we can kind of catch ourselves if we are engaging in any kind of biasness. So yes, I'm excited. And yes, to add to it, Jill is also, I'm super excited and a little bit nervous as well, because I consider Jill as my mentor too. And it's really special for me to have her on Intercultural Conversations. So I'm just going to add Jill here. Being really close to the screen. Jill. Hey, Jill.
Hello.
Hi. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure that you would consider, well, it's a delight rather, that you would consider me a mentor. The feeling is mutual.
Of course, and thank you. Thank you so much for taking out the time for this. And of course, you had the opportunity to listen to the introduction a bit. So I'm going to dive right into it, right?
All right.
And I wanted to approach this conversation with the perspective of, firstly, I mean, we use this term bias so loosely, without kind of understanding what it means. And I think that is with many terminologies. We do that. It's just part of the language, and we use it for many situations, of course, as well. So not only from your perspective, but also as a fact, right? What are biases? So for example, I think you're very beautiful and intelligent. Is that a bias? Is that a fact? Is that on it? What? I mean, I think for myself and for the people who are listening, what would you consider a bias to be, and how does it show up in our daily lives?
All right. I'm going to resist the urge to respond to that and just give you specifically what we talk about when we talk about bias. And hopefully that will answer the question for you. First, the moment we start the conversation about understanding bias, I think it's really important that we understand a little bit about the hardware that we are operating with as human beings, and particularly brain. So to understand what bias is, we need to understand the inner workings of the human brain a little bit. I'm sure many of you know that the brain is a very powerful tool. It processes millions, 10 to 11 million bits of information per second. We are extremely sensory beings, and we are constantly taking in information through our five senses and arguably even others, and processing that information and trying to make use of that information. So that much data, which is coming in every single second, has to be managed somehow to make sense of the world, and to make it possible for us to live in it and function. So our brain, the human brain, developed this ability to create patterns of recognition that would become useful to us. It could be anything from when I see something on the horizon and I see that it's a group of people on horseback and I see they're wearing a particular kind of feather in their hair, I will immediately know whether that is a friend or that is a foe. And I'm imagining, let's say, the early 1900s on the plains of North America, where I am from, or my ancestors as well, in the American Southwest. The ability to identify that or gather that data and make a split-second assumption, which is really a manifestation of a bias, was often the difference between life and death. So in the early days of civilization, even more so, we required these biases, or we required this ability to be able to make very, very quick decisions for our own survival. So bias is something which is absolutely necessary. And I think this is something that people are often confused by. They're like, wait a second, I thought we were supposed to overcome our bias or combat our bias, but that bias was a negative and evil thing. Bias itself, or the ability to make sense and apply patterns based on our previous experiences, is a very useful, process in the human brain. I think what's interesting, though, is that, of course, we have evolved as a species, and most of us, on a day-to-day basis, do not need to be making these kinds of judgments, especially around our safety and security. I don't walk around the corner and fear that a Bengal tiger is going to jump out and devour me. So I don't necessarily need that ability to think fast and make a quick decision with the same amount of importance that 5 or 6 generations ago did. But we're still operating with this hardware that is designed to help us make sense of this information. So I think that's the first and important point, that one, bias itself is not evil or negative. We all have it as well. And in some ways it manifests in ways that are helpful to us as a species, and other ways it can be very, very detrimental to us as well. I think that's the first thing. So if I go back to your point about intelligence or beauty, it's a bias. Yes, there's a whole lot you have to unpack there. In instance, our definitions of beauty are often a cultural construct and a result of evolution in what we've been taught and told to look at is beautiful. There's also, again, an evolutionary aspect of that as well, in terms of looking for potential partners based on the way that they look, and your ability to reproduce, and all of these different things come in this multifaceted lens that you mentioned, in terms of whether or not people perceive someone as attractive or intelligent. So yes, in a sense, it's a form of bias, an opinion, etc., and it has its uses, and it also can have a down or a shadow side, if you will, as well.
That's true. Like you mentioned that we are hardwired that way, as humans, and that's the reason why it still exists even after centuries of evolution. It's somewhere still there. So do you think, like, right now in the environment that we're living in, what are kind of the perils of them having these kind of biases, and is it important then for us to recognize that we are coming from a place of bias? Like you mentioned, maybe me having an opinion about your beauty or your intelligence comes from many other things, just by the fact that I know you personally as well, right? So that is a bias as well that comes into play. But do you think it's necessary for us, and I speak also in a very sensitive moment in time in India, where there are certain opinions, for example, that are made about certain groups of people based on the information that we receive. So, and it's also considered a threat, right? Certain groups of people are now considered a threat. So, firstly, is it necessary for us to recognize it? Are there perils to not recognizing it? Are there disadvantages, rather?
Absolutely, 100%. And so if we want to break down what those potential perils are, we have to look at particular types of bias. So there are many, depending on the models or the authors or the methodologies that you look at. Some people will say 10, 15, 20, 35, 46 different types of bias. And if we take,
we have all the time in the world.
If we talk about cognitive bias, or there are different subcategories, etc. So if I just take a very common one that I think there are a lot of challenges with, and as you said, in today's day and age, with regard to particularly some of the perils, is something called confirmation bias. And in the intercultural space, confirmation bias is very, very detrimental to individuals who are entering into spaces where they're utilizing information that was told to them by somebody else, by experiences that were not their own. Maybe they had learned to be fearful of a particular group of people, or an ethnic group of, an ethnicity, or even an age or a gender, or whatever it may be. So confirmation bias, in terms of the definition, is that any strongly held belief that we have. Now, the source of it can be even internal, or it can be learned, an external kind of, again, a kind of conditioning. But the point being, the belief itself is extremely, extremely, extremely essential to our identity. It's a very strongly held belief. And funnily enough, a lot of times, even our most strongly held beliefs are not genuinely known to us, or we're not as aware of them until someone else will come and point them out. And I'll give you a quick example. So if we're talking about confirmation, confirmation bias, and particularly in the intercultural space, if you grew up with a certain sort of attitude or understanding about a particular group of people. So in the Indian context, for example, there could be a community that is very frugal. In other words, cheap. It could be a community that is very aggressive, or it leans towards violence. It could be a bias or a confirmation, a deeply held belief that, women have a particular role to play in society. It's something that you learn subconsciously and consciously as well throughout your childhood. So if you have a deeply held belief that this particular person from this community come from business family, don't they all? They all do. And I had friends who did, and, et cetera, et cetera. When we walk into spaces making assumptions, when we meet people about, or in a way, stereotyping, generalizations, and all kinds of ideas about people before we actually get to know them, leave that aside. The most dangerous part of confirmation bias is that the brain actually ignores information which is counter to that belief. So, for example, if I believe that, people from this particular community in India are all from the business community and all have very frugal attitudes with regard to how they spend their money, even when I have a friend who is from that community, who has a very different, let's say, lifestyle, or leads a very unique, you can say, has a background or upbringing that's completely different than my belief, my brain will not register that information. It's almost as if we have these big, giant blinders on. It's a complete blind spot. So you can
it's like biological, almost. Biological.
Right. This is why it's so dangerous. Confirmation bias is so dangerous, because we're not even aware of what we are not seeing. Something as simple as, people from, let's say, all women are bad drivers, or, in my culture in the United States, it was actually Asians are bad drivers. So this was a deeply held belief. And what I mean to say is that when someone cuts you off and it's a Caucasian, middle-aged, male, we don't even see it, because we have this strongly held belief that the person driving that car is Asian, or the person driving that car is a woman. So our brain actually blocks out the information that is in contrast or contradicts our deeply held beliefs. So this is a very dangerous form of bias, and you can imagine the perils.
I mean, I have been guilty of that. Like, now that you're saying it, I have been, especially when I was in my rebellion phase and growing up and just learning the politics of the country and ideas of feminism and what it means to be feminist, for example, as well. It was so, I would be so defensive. I could physically feel the anger when anybody would justify an opposing point. If anybody justified anything, or if I read articles that negated my way of thinking, I would then not believe them. I'd be like, the source is wrong, or the source is biased, or, who's this journalist who's written it? However, if it was articles supporting the way I thought, the way I felt, and it wouldn't be the same amount of, rigor and research into going into seeing if their opinion. I think now journalism has become more about opinion, and a lot of research papers also have become a lot about opinion, if it's substantiated or not. So I think I have been guilty of that too. It's only after I've moved away from home and seen people's biases towards me, like as an Indian woman living in a place that's, where I don't speak the language, where it's completely new culture. When you are faced with that is when a little bit of there's a little bit of a mindset shift. For example, people giving me their laptops, like spoiled laptops, or laptops that weren't functioning, to fix. I mean, I can barely turn mine on. How am I supposed? So even those biases. And those biases when you finish it. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, and just to comment on what you started with in your introduction about the way we engage virtually and the way we interact online, and the data that is collected on ourselves by different search engines and other platforms. These services are designed to identify what your deeply held beliefs are, so that they can reaffirm and reconfirm them to you when you search for certain things. And that is extremely dangerous. And so in the last couple of years, there have been a couple of these big tech companies that have come out and said that, we have tried to fix the algorithm to make sure that when you Google something, like, is it true that? And you look for something, for example, 4 or 5 will confirm your deeply held belief, but there'll be 1 or 2 links in there or 1 or 2 resources that provide an alternative perspective. So confirmation bias is only being fed, by the monster that is the internet, if you will. And this can be really, really concerning. And as an individual, that's consuming content online, it's really, really important that you are fully aware of the fact that, your data has been accessed in terms of what you look for, shop for, share, etc. And there will be a lot of things. If you are looking for a genuine, non-bias answer or piece of information about any topic, you have to dig a little bit deeper than the first 10 or even 20 things that will pop at the top of that list.
Jill, what an expectation to have. We live in a time where we have like 20-second videos giving us information, right? And I don't know if it's expecting a lot from people to actually form an opinion or form a perspective after that much of research. I think when we talk about it from a larger perspective, from a mass perspective, for the lack of a better word, I don't expect people to do that. I'd rather prefer that researchers and publishing platforms and journalists kind of take that responsibility because it's their job and they make money off of it, that such kind of conflict is not created, right? And especially as interculturalists, we see, and for me, a lot of cultural conflicts as well happen because of biases. And I mean, you and I, we conduct these workshops and we know most of the statements that are made come from such a deep-seated bias or belief about certain groups of people. And then it becomes our responsibility, and we take that responsibility to at least have that bit of a paradigm or a perspective shift. So I think rather putting that responsibility on people, there are people who are working toward kind of doing their job right to kind of erase that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I can't really comment on big tech and journalism. I think that might derail our conversation a bit. But if you go back and look at bias, and in addition to confirmation bias, affinity bias is another one that is really, really has a stronghold on nearly every individual. We act and interact in ways that we naturally tend to gravitate towards people who look like us, talk like us, act like us, and most importantly, think like us. So that's the big one. The hidden factors of diversity can really come and bite you. I know I've met a lot of Gen Zs in India, and they're like, oh, I've got so many friends from so many different cultures and religions and ethnic groups, and none of that thing really matters, and etc. And then when you pull them together and you do an activity in a workshop, even run a psychometric instrument that measures cognitive diversity, you see that they're actually completely the same in terms of the way they think, in terms of the way they make decisions, in terms of the way they manage time, in terms of the actual practical aspects of the way that they live and work. You'll find many similarities. So you have this challenging factor around affinity bias, not just in the terms of how we look or the religion that we practice, or our sexual orientation, or whatever it may be. But we also have the natural tendency to gravitate towards people who think like us. So if we talk about some amount of personal accountability, so leaving aside, like I said, big tech and journalism, if you become aware of this, if you recognize the fact that, I have a pretty diverse group of friends, but actually, we tend to have very similar aspects of our personality, for example. Or maybe you don't. Maybe it's most of your close people, most of your go-to people. This could be friends, this could be colleagues at work, whoever it may be. These people that I go to, that I trust, I have this very interesting thought of, okay, wait, they're actually all women. They're all between the ages of 30 and 40. Most of them are, fill in the blank. You start, oh my gosh, they're actually quite similar to me. Yeah. The clear sign of affinity bias. Then your next step is to try and invite someone into your inner circle. Try and befriend someone. Try and interact with someone in your office who doesn't check all of those boxes around affinity bias or similar cognitive, decision-making styles or whatever it may be. Because that's something which has real impact, and it might be difficult. Just the way intercultural exchanges and intercultural friendships or intercultural marriages,
Exactly.
or intercultural global projects, there can be a lot of potential challenges for building trust, for building that relationship in a way that is going to be, mutually beneficial, sustainable in the long term. And one of the ways that you can kind of counteract that affinity bias, even when you're young, is to do that very thing. Invite people into, try and find ways to include people in your inner circle that don't fall into those categories, and it'll prepare you for challenging conversations later in life.
Yes, and I did face that challenging conversation through intercultural conversations itself, because I was talking about, and especially with everything with the OBC, ST, and reservation debate that has been happening in India for the longest time, and I always seem to have an opinion about it without having an immediate friend in my circle who was from the Dalit community, or who was a person from the tribal community even. So, and it's not that they were not accessible to me. It's just that, I just suddenly realized that I'm making an opinion just based on the information that I read without even interacting with the person of the community. And that's when I also invited a Dalit artist over, and just to listen to her perspectives gave me such a paradigm shift as well. And that's my personal experience that has been. And, you were talking about your intercultural marriage as well, like at a very personal level. And of course, you don't have to talk about it if it's very, it's very close to you. But even having lived in India, did you, for example, catch yourself, being judgmental or being, Okay. By the way, just since we're talking about the language of it, can judgment be a bias? I mean, can they be used interchangeably?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll give another example, and I'm trying to give as many examples of forms of bias again for your audience, because I think some of them people really relate to, or something might resonate with them. So let me share another form of bias, which is very closely related to judgment. Which is called the curse of knowledge. It has a variety of different names. I like this name, the curse of knowledge. So the curse of knowledge is a very simple, common sense kind of bias. We grow up with this idea that this is how things are done, because this is the environment in which we live and work. And so what is common sense is common. Now, as interculturalists, we know that common sense is not common. Common sense does not translate across cultures at all. First moved to India, I had a lot of this kind of bias, which is like, isn't it obvious? Hello, how could it be done any differently? Or even an even more loaded form of bias, which is that, okay, well, this is how it's done because that's how it's done correctly, or that's the right way to do it, or that's the best way to do it. And anything else is inferior. And so this is what we call the curse of knowledge. It can also be looked at as a bias where someone who has a lot of information about something, then they will often have less empathy for those that do not. And since we were talking about intercultural marriages, I'll give you an example. My husband is an automotive journalist, and I will pick up conversations about motorcycles and what is countersteering, or, how do you set up the suspension on this type of bike, and what is damping, and all these kinds of things. And if you're in that world, it's very easy to look at something or someone and be like, what kind of idiot doesn't know how to set up their own suspension, or what kind of, person doesn't know that this is how you steer a motorcycle. And so sometimes what you take for granted, which is knowledge that you have based on your experience and based on your years in the industry, or your countless hours, learning the skill that you have and gaining that information. After you do it for a while, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, you start to take it for granted. And you start to make assumptions that everyone knows that, right? Hello, how could you be so stupid that you don't even know that that's what that is? So this is also the curse of knowledge. And I think when I first moved to India, I suffered greatly from this kind of curse of making assumptions that what was so common sense, how could you not know that, was a really, really massive, massive mistake. And I also suffered the reverse. So my Indian friends or my Indian colleagues would be like, what kind of an idiot doesn't know that? And I'm like, I don't know, like, I don't know what you're talking about. So you're either passing that judgment, making assumptions about people, or you're on the receiving end of that judgment. And that particular kind of bias is it's definitely not a way to build a long-lasting, again, mutually beneficial, sustainable relationship, be it in your personal life or in your professional life.
Yes, and that's so dangerous, right? That's so dangerous that I don't think then you tap into the potential of a person, of a relationship, when you make these kind of preconceived judgments. So, I mean, just from a very practical perspective, on a very everyday level, what is it something that people can do in order to catch themselves? Or to even know that they are coming from a place of bias? Because I have realized growing up that truth is so subjective. Truth is, and it depends on the person who's looking at a situation. So truth can be subjective as well, and you make judgments based on what you think is true, is the truth. But, on an everyday level, while interacting with people from different communities or making judgments about people, how do we ensure then that we are not coming from a place of bias?
Mm-hmm. So there are many steps. I mean, the first step is coming to terms with the fact that you are biased. So there is not a single person on the planet. In fact, even people will argue whether or not chimpanzees, we can even move into the animal kingdom to talk about bias, but let's stick to our species. Every human being on the planet is biased in some way. So one is accepting that we all have bias, and we all operate with different levels of bias in different ways. It doesn't make us evil or make us a bad person, but to not look at our biases and not turn inward and sort of reflect on in what ways could I possibly be giving maybe an unearned advantage to a person or a group of people, or even an unearned disadvantage, which becomes a form of discrimination, which is very, very serious. So in what ways could I be practicing and acting on these biases in a way that are not serving me, and not serving my community, not serving my family, my relationship, or my workplace, whatever it may be? This is the first thing that you have to accept, a certain level of self-acceptance that it exists. The second thing is to educate yourself. We only talked about 3 kinds of bias. There's a whole variety of different types that it's really important to have at least a general understanding, and then do some really self-reflective activities to understand where am I strongly biased? Like, what are my deeply held beliefs, and in what ways am I ignoring the truth, ignoring factual information as a result of my confirmation bias? Where am I making others suffer from the curse of knowledge? In what ways am I acting from affinity bias in the hiring process, or in generating a friendship circle, or whatever it may be? So making yourself aware of these different types of bias, and then being very self-reflective on how they affect you and how they affect your communities is really important. In addition to that, there are some very general inclusive actions that I'd be happy to share, which are very, very basic. And I would say, again, we don't want to say it's common sense, but they're not things, it's not rocket science. Let's put it that way. It's not rocket science. So we know that, we see things not the way they are, but the way we are. So I see things not necessarily the way they are, but the way I am. That I accept. How can I be more inclusive? I can be more inclusive by inviting those perspectives, inviting people into conversations who have very different perspectives, maybe very differently held beliefs than I do, and releasing my agenda, which means really trying to remove that lens, that bias, especially in the listening, in the listening phase of those interactions. Really, really takes a lot of effort to keep a check on your reactions and trying to respond instead of react, etc. Another inclusive action, besides inviting more diversity into your inner circle and practicing assertive listening, I think one of the most important ones, and you asked me about the personal stuff, one of the things that I still tell myself, because I've lived in India now for 20 years. Holy hell, 20 years I've lived here in India. And I still remind myself on a day-to-day basis that, Jill, assume good intentions. Most of the time, people are not trying to offend you, frustrate you, or even flatter you, cheat you, or even flatter you as well. Like it doesn't always have to be on the negative side, but assume good intentions. Assume that that person did not engage in this interaction with the intention of, sabotaging your call, whatever it may be. Or I'm thinking more from a work perspective. So if you assume good intentions, and you start from a point of assuming good intentions, especially when you are interacting with people who are very different from you, you're in a very diverse intercultural situation, whatever form that may be, just start from a place of assuming good intentions. And as and when you realize, you come to know, you have an open conversation with people, and you realize, or a person, and you realize, okay, actually something else is going on, or maybe I understand that there's a good intention, but I still don't like the outcome. I still am not comfortable with the outcome. So maybe somebody's told a joke that you thought was inappropriate, culturally inappropriate, or sexist, or racist, or whatever it may be. I don't immediately jump to the conclusion that you're a sexist, racist, beep hole, whatever. I will assume some good intentions. I will interact with that person and say, hey, the other day, I know it was just a joke, but, it's something that I think made a lot of people uncomfortable. And I know you would never want to do that. So here's where we're assuming good intentions. I know that you would never intentionally want to make anybody feel uncomfortable, which is why I'm telling you, because if I were you, I would want to know. And this is this is a two-way street. So at any point in time, if you also notice something that I do, and I made so many mistakes my first couple of years living in India, and I still make mistakes to this day, but I unavoidably offended people, or I acted in a way that was so culturally inappropriate. And I look back and I feel a lot of shame now when I look back to those particular situations. I offended one of my very senior bosses in one of my first companies by speaking very, very out of turn and very aggressively, and complete loss of face, and embarrassing that I think about it now. I can promise you that wasn't my intention. But I also need people in my circle who are confident enough and have a trust enough to come to me and say, hey, Jill, earlier today in the meeting when you said that was totally inappropriate. And you should really, you might want to go and talk to that person and try and make things better, because I know that wasn't your intention, but that's what happened. So I think for an inclusive action, which is just assuming good intentions, and having that open dialogue to make sure that, okay, we're not just accepting behavior that we don't find appropriate, or that we feel is not, is the outcome is not what we want. But we start from that positive intention, and then we have that conversation. And whatever we give, we have to be willing to get as well. That's a given.
Yeah, I mean, assuming good intention is something that I've had to work with a lot, because I think when you are assuming something like good intention, it comes attached with a lot of trust as well. And, Indian society is generally relatively a lower trust society. And it takes a bit of time to then develop that understanding. But I think it's also helped me. It's made me feel better as well when you understand that the intention was not how I felt it. And of course, that can happen only with open dialogue. And you sometimes then are in positions of initiating that dialogue too. I think that's where people usually find it uncomfortable, So, for example, like you mentioned, like a racist joke or a sexist joke, if I have felt uncomfortable in the past, I've not been able to confront it or open any dialogue about it later on either. So then I'm just like assuming that the intention was good, but then I sit with that feeling of being offended without having addressed it. So I think I just hope and wish that people find in themselves to then open dialogue with respect to that. Of course, not in an offensive or a defensive way, but actually that it leads to some kind of conversation for sure.
Yeah. I've been having these kinds of conversations, and I've been supporting people in organizations having these kinds of conversations for quite a long time now. And I'll be very honest, it doesn't always go well. There are situations where people are not in a position to confront their own bias, or they feel they're being reverse judged or criticized, etc. And that's a really challenging situation. And so I've always advised people to try and make sure that this is done through a person that is well trusted. You know, so for example, if I don't have established trust with this person who happened to, who I noticed, you know, during the hiring process, there was a very strong affinity bias for this particular region of India, for example, and I noticed it and I felt uncomfortable about it, but I don't have a very good relationship with that person. Maybe I'm new to the organization, whatever it may be. So having a, you know, talking to a peer of that individual where there's established trust and credibility and saying, hey, I noticed this and I know this person is really nice and I know that he or she would never, you know, purposefully discriminate against anyone from any particular community knowingly, you know, and I'm sure it's an unconscious bias and many of us have, but I still think it should be addressed. And so you're a person who's close and, you know, I want to how to handle the situation, because there's a lot of politics, a lot of drama, especially in organizations. And for those that have had the conversation directly, which again, I can think of a few examples, one particular company I worked with, they said that they actually came out of that conversation with such a deeper level of respect and mutual trust that, you know, you know, of course, nobody wants to have that conversation, but after having that hard conversation, the outcome was very, very, very positive. And they became accountability partners. And as difficult as the conversation was, it actually led to a kind of relationship capital between those two individuals.
It's a high risk, high return. It's difficult. Yeah, you risk a lot, but then there's a lot of return with respect to that. So yes, I mean, I'm in a place in life where I'm okay and open to have that, but I think not everybody has that level of comfort, and it's a slow process. You know, you eventually learn. Yes, please go ahead.
No, I just say one last thing, because I think that this would be really useful, not just for you, but also for your listeners, is just this one word, which is curiosity. And this is what I would attribute to my mentor, who one of my mentors, Vandana Saxena-Puria. She always talks about approaching situations with a kind of curiosity and even a kind of playfulness. And I think this is such a beautiful thing when we talk about unconscious bias and cognitive diversity and intercultural communication, because starting with good intentions, yes, but even when something has happened, be curious about it. What happened? Why did it happen? What could the possible reasons be? You know, so you go with a kind of playful curiosity, because this could be really serious. It feels heavy, you know. It feels heavy even in our hearts and our souls sometimes, especially if we've been discriminated against or we felt discriminated against. Or, you know, perhaps somebody has come and told us that you did something and it really wasn't appreciated or was culturally inappropriate, whatever it may be. So approach these situations with curiosity, with a kind of playfulness around what has happened in the idea, because that will automatically kind of create a potential for what is called higher levels of psychological safety. We can end our conversation kind of how we began. If we think about the human brain, you know, the human brain processing information with one core agenda: to keep us alive, to keep us safe, and to keep us alive. So we need psychological safety, because when we don't feel safe, when we feel threatened, if you come and tell me that, Jill, you said something which was culturally inappropriate, I immediately go into threat mode. And then I can fight you, I can run away from you, or I can freeze, fight, flight, or freeze. And so when that happens, we have to really, really calm that, that process in our brain that is trying to protect us from the threat. We want to try and remind ourselves that this is a psychologically safe place. Prata is not attacking me. She doesn't have a sword. She's not literally stabbing me in the chest with it. It might feel like that emotionally, but it's really not what's happening. So I approach it from this place of playful curiosity, and not allow myself to react from the old hardware, from the old brain, from the outdated hardware, if you will. And that can be really, really useful as well. So,
yeah, I think it can be helpful for our brains to upgrade finally. I'm just waiting for that to happen as well, so that we can just adapt to all of this, and they'll be like, no wars, no conflict, no one's fighting. We've all adapted to everything around
where's that
us.
download? I don't see the download now. Where's the download button for that? I want the upgrade too.
So, yes, we're way over time. It's such an interesting conversation. So I usually end the episode by asking this particular question because it's very close to me as well. If there was one thing that you would want to change, either within yourself or in your immediate environment or just the environment at large, what would you like to change and why?
And you told me about some of these questions, and I forgot about that one. Now I'm like, oh my gosh, on the spot. If there's one thing that I would want to change within myself or my immediate environment. I think what I would want to change is a particular kind of bias, which is this bias where I think at all stages in society, it's very common, especially people who are, exposed to information or relatively globally mobile, etc., to feel like we're all doomed. Oh my God, the earth is on fire, and politics this, and this is happening and that's happening, refugees camp, etc., etc. And I do not want to diminish the challenges of generation. Absolutely, these are very, very monumental, enormous, large, grave challenges that we are facing, and particularly the younger generation. But I think what I would change is I would want to increase the amount of hope that we feel. Because if you really look at human history, and you look at all of the factors that we can measure human progress on, we have really, really come a long way. Even with this outdated hardware that we're still running, we have really, really come a long way. So this is something that I remind myself of as well, but I would also want for all the people in my community and in the external environment as well, is, be hopeful, not hopefully naive, not hopeful, not thoughts and prayers, not that kind of hopeful, but just remember that we have come a long way. We have a long way to go, but kind of keeping that positivity, keeping that optimism, because I am optimistic. Not every day, but I'd like to be optimistic. I'd like to be more optimistic. And I definitely want to imagine a future for my 7-year-old daughter where a lot of the challenges that we're facing even today don't exist for her generation. So that's what I would want to change.
That's great. Being hopeful. I mean, Vishant has a follow-up question, though. He asked, how would you like to bring this change? Mm-hmm. I think he means, how would you probably implement it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a very personal thing, but for me, I think everybody else would have different ways of managing this. It could even be shielding yourself from certain kinds of negative information or negative news. It could be finding ways to give back to your community at a grassroots level and keeping up that hope and optimism, etc. For me, a lot of it has to do with my internal process. So whether it's meditation, whether it's breath work, whether it's even just taking a few moments to come back into myself. That for me, because the hopeful optimism is in there. And I think sometimes my energy gets impacted by what's happening in the world, and then we tend to feel slightly doom and gloom or slightly more pessimistic. So for me, it's actually a matter of going back into myself, particularly, in fact, one of the most practical things is connection to nature. Oh my God, just go in the freaking forest, sit with a tree, put your hands in the sand if you're near any beach, whatever it may be. But going back to nature will often also restore that simple exposure to abundance. It could be abundance in the sense the granules of sand. It could be abundance, the leaves in the tree, the clouds in the sky. But being surrounded by the beauty of nature and the abundance of nature automatically inspires that hope and optimism.
Same.
Yeah.
So, yes, Jill, I think I've taken up a lot of your time.
It's Friday night. Come on, we must.
But
Weekend is starting.
yes, weekend is starting. Good way for me, at least, to start my weekend. So much I took away from this conversation. I'm going to let it marinate a bit over the Saturday and Sunday as well. But thank you so much, Jill. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your insights and a lot of the takeaways that you've shared. And I hope to see you soon, actually.
I'm sure we will meet. Yeah. If not before the new year, yes. I'm thinking before the new year. I have a sneaky suspicion that we will meet. I'll be in by the end of December, so we can meet.
We can. Okay, thank you so much, Jill. And thank you everybody for joining in and for your questions. Thanks, Ishant. Bye.
Bye-bye.